Well, hello and welcome to the session, Cash Payments and Policy, Our Critical Philanthropic Strategies. My name is Tianka Perkins-Ramawi, and I was involved in the partnership between Robbins Foundation and the City of Richmond to launch a guaranteed income in Richmond. And Amy?
Hey, my name is Amy Nagel, and I'm director of the EITC Funders Network. It's the table around which charitable foundations who are interested in tax credits and their efforts to reduce poverty here in America, we gather around to talk about outreach and engagement strategies. And just to close the loop, how tax credits relate to cash payments is that, in fact, they're really long-standing forms of cash payments here in the United States. If you get your tax bill down to zero, you get that tax credit back in your pocket, which is a form of cash payment.
Thank you. Dr. Martin West?
Hey there, I'm Dr. Stacia West. I am an associate professor in the College of Social Work at the University of Tennessee, and then I am also the co-founder and director of the Center for Guaranteed Income Research at the University of Pennsylvania. And so essentially what we do is we run randomized controlled trials on unconditional cash all across the US. So we're running 27 different experiments right now in different US cities.
And Dr. Nyandoro?
Greetings, I'm Aisha Yandoro. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Springboard Opportunities based in Jackson, Mississippi. We provide programs and services to families that live in federally subsidized affordable housing. And I'm also the founder of the Magnolia Mothers Trust, which is a guaranteed income project that provides cash disbursements, cash without restrictions to extremely low income Black mothers that live in federally subsidized affordable housing.
Well, thank you all for being here today. One thing that would be great to start with is just to level set for the audience. So what do we mean by cash payments? When we say that, what does that mean?
Didn't quite know who you wanted to go with, so I'll go, and then I can definitely let Dr. West go, and Amy as well. So what we mean by cash payments, it could mean different things depending on who you're talking to. So let's just say that. When I talk about my work, I'm very clear to say it's guaranteed income. It's not universal basic income, which is very different. And the way we've set up our guaranteed income project, it's a cash disbursement, cash without restrictions that is given directly to individuals who fit within a certain frame. So for us, our frame is Black women, Black mothers that live in federally subsidized affordable housing. You can develop that frame based on whatever your parameters are within your community or whatever your parameters are within the geography or demographics that you're working with. But that's what it is. You know, when we're talking about cash disbursements, it's really this cash without restrictions, reoccurring, given whatever that term is to individuals.
I agree with Dr. Nyandoro. There's a million different names for unconditional cash or guaranteed income or universal basic income. And depending on what discipline you come from, you probably call it a different thing, but there is a difference kind of in the semantics of it. So when we talk about universal basic income, what we mean is universal and that every individual would be eligible to receive it. Basic in that it covers your basic needs and typically that it is recurrent. What we see now in kind of the most recent iteration of like the proliferation of cash experimentation is folks really talking about a guaranteed income. So it's not necessarily enough to meet your basic needs, but it has those hallmarks that Dr. Nyandoro talked about, that it is recurring, so typically on a monthly basis, and that it has no strings attached. And so we also use the term guaranteed income because it is rooted in a history of racial and economic justice. And that is the term that Dr. King actually used to describe it. So that's where we bring that language from. Amy?
Yeah. I mean, you all have so ably described the terrain. I think it's interesting just to, as a comparative point on the tax credits actually have elements of this and are even evolving and testing it. So this, when you get that cash back in your pocket, it is unrestricted. You families, low-income families who are receiving those tax credits use it for any myriad of their needs, food security, new tires on their cars, pay for childcare expenses. It is that unrestricted, which is such an important element. And while historically the tax credits have come at tax time, there's now a little bit of an experiment going on right now with the child tax credit of trying it out monthly and seeing how that works administratively and how does that work for families. So it is playing in this space much in the ways that have been described.
Now we'll, zoom out just a little bit and say that, in philanthropy, I think that we've seen cash show up in different ways. Sometimes they have been one-time payments, sometimes they've been part of programs where they were part of wraparound supports, but you are seeing more philanthropic partnership to launch guaranteed income programs. And I'll just say in Richmond, our work actually in the guaranteed income space grew out of a one-time cash assistance fund that was launched at the beginning of the pandemic, and sort of seeing the responses that families were kind enough to share with us about what they were concerned about in the future and about their state of economic security or insecurity, that kind of led to the discussion around, well, what if families have more sustained support? What would be the impact of that? So thank you for sort of giving the audience an overview of all these different ways that cash shows up. I do want to ask about the moment that we're in right now, because it is very different than it has been. We are seeing a whole movement around cash payments. And can you all help the audience understand maybe why that's happening and what that means, what we're actually seeing play out?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of reasons why that's happening. And I think the conversation or the statement that you just made prior is a good setup to what it is that we're seeing and why it's happening. So we're still in a pandemic. So we are still in an economic crisis. And because of the pandemic and the economic crisis that we're up against, the precarious nature of so many individuals' lives has become known to the masses. For those of us who have been working on guaranteed income for years, like it's myself and Dr. West, the pieces that we have been saying and screaming from the rooftops for forever, folks are finally saying, oh yes, cash actually works and we should just give people money and trust that they know what to do with it. So we are in this moment that we see that most Americans we have been saying that most Americans don't have the actual financial resources to weather a storm, but we're actually seeing what that looks like. So it's one thing to say it as a data point, but when you see the food banks and when you see individuals not being able to pay their rent or pay their mortgage, it puts a different context on it. So what we are seeing is that this very real time reality is meeting a moment that those of us, once again, who have been advocates were prepared for. So when we got into last March of 2020 and we saw what was happening in the world, those of us were like, okay, we just need to figure out how do we deploy cash much more quickly. We already have these mechanisms in place. We already know it can be done. We already know that it actually works. We have terminologies for it. We just need to do it. And thankfully, philanthropy and so many other partners met us in the moment, which is why we now have this explosion of guaranteed income projects. There are over 100 guaranteed income projects being planned in some iteration around this country, either being led by community-based organizations, being led by universities, being led by cities. And that is all because of the opportunity met the moment and we were positioned with the answer. And so I applaud philanthropy for being ready and accepting the challenge. I want philanthropy to do more in liberating capital so that we can actually push this towards federal policy so that we don't need these various pilots to try to figure out how to go on in perpetuity. But it's just, quite frankly, we're here because of COVID. Do I think that we would have gotten here as quickly as we did had it not been for COVID? Unfortunately, no. I don't think that we are, I don't think that we're that kind in this country. I can't think of a different way to say it, but that's just the reality of what I feel about us right now. So yeah.
I agree with you. I also kudos to philanthropy for getting this started, right? So I'll give a little bit of history, but it's not boring because it involves Dolly Parton and her philanthropic sort of commitments to this space. So back in 2016, 2015, very few people were talking about guaranteed income in the academic space, in the world of philanthropy. And one of the things that kind of spurred this movement along with Dr. Nyanduro's project was that there was some wildfires in Tennessee in 2016 and 1,000 people lost their homes. And what happened is Dolly Parton ran this like telethon fundraiser. Maybe some of you remember it, where she raised $11 million in like 2 days. And what she ended up doing was providing a guaranteed income kind of without knowing it, where she gave 1,000 families $1,000 a month for 6 months. And so that's the first time that we saw this kind of big broad scale acceptance in the world of philanthropy around the idea of just trusting people to make their own decisions with cash. And so the way that I see that transforming now is that instead of using cash as sort of a one-time response, as we see with economic stimulus payments, or as focusing it towards sort of an environmental disaster, unconditional cash is now focused toward an economic disaster, right? That we all saw kind of leading into the pandemic, and that was certainly exacerbated by the pandemic. So I want to say for all of the funders in this space, of which there are many that provided that money for disbursements, what you have done is allowed us to experiment kind of through like 2016, 2018, 2019. And then leading into the pandemic, we saw the evidence for cash that then allowed the use of ARPA funds and CARES Act dollars to help people weather the pandemic and ultimately expand the child tax credit. That said, there's still work to be done in this space.
Mhm. Mhm.
Absolutely. Let us not let this opportunity go to waste. There's so much good that can be done right now, and philanthropy has done such an amazing job of leaning in and really pushing hard to make sure that these expansions are a success. So it's an important time to pay attention.
And you all have brought up some points that we'll certainly get to later about how this connects to policy in this moment and what philanthropy's role is. But before we go too far, I do want to spend some time talking about what is the impact of cash payments. So I think it's important to talk about not just what the research is saying, but also what we're hearing from recipients. And so if you all could share what the impact is, particularly across focus areas, which tends to be, you know, how our work is siloed.
I'll do the boring part, which is the data points first.
You don't do them boring. When you talk about it, I get so excited. So I'm like, they should go.
Okay. All right. So I can provide some early findings, kind of pre-pandemic findings of what we saw in Stockton, California. So that pilot launched back in 2018, 2019. And so this is just kind of first year data. We looked at really 3 key things in that first year data of, can guaranteed income disrupt income volatility? Understanding that many Americans have considerable fluctuations in income, right? By being a shift worker or a gig worker, you cannot really count on having a consistent income. So can a guaranteed income kind of level that out, right? And so certainly we found to give people a consistent income, obviously, right, they're going to have less volatility. But what we also saw in that is that allowed people to kind of free up mental space, right, and imagine a different future. And so the second thing that we measured was mental and physical health, right? So what we saw in the first year is that for the treatment group compared to the control group, we saw less incidence of anxiety and depression. We also saw improvements in physical functioning. So people just being able to function better in their communities, at work, in their families. And then the most incredible finding that surprised many of us was that people actually worked more when they received a guaranteed income. So the $500 a month actually brought the rate of full-time employment among the treatment group from 28% at the start of the experiment full-time to 40% full-time, right? And you know, working with this population for many years, it's actually not that surprising, because what we know is that money freed up women mostly, right, to be able to secure childcare, right, so they could work full-time, or that they were able to take time off of work to secure a better position, which maybe would have not been possible before, simply because they would have lost that day of pay. So those are the 3 key findings that we have out of Stockton. What about Jackson?
Yeah, so similar to Stockton, we definitely started looking, when we started our evaluation process, really just trying to get a better understanding of what cash would do when infused into the lives of families. And particularly for us, it was an important conversation or important data point that we needed to figure out, because of the population that we work with makes less than $12,000 annually. And it's a population that's highly subsidized. And so we needed to make sure that by virtue of how our social safety net sets up and the punitive aspect of it, that we were doing good without harm. So we did not want this cash to come in and push individuals off of benefits. We didn't think that it would occur, but we had to actually have the proof of concept to demonstrate that it would not. And we also needed to make sure that that families actually had enough that they would have the net gain of actually having the cash once they had to deal with all of the offsets with their subsidies. And so what we've learned is that yes, cash helps. We do $1,000, and on average, individuals have a decrease of about $300 to $400 in their benefits. But by virtue of it being cash without restrictions, they still have that net gain of $600 to $700, and they're able to use it however they want. And families indicate that that is still a win in spite of the fact that there is a reduction in some of the benefits, because they have the ability to have agency. So we've shown that. The other pieces, that we've shown is that individuals are able to show up differently in their kids' lives. Parents feel like they're better parents because they can actually say yes to some of the things that their kids want, not just having to say yes to the needs. They're able to show up more and be more engaged in their local community. They're able to get out of debt. They're able to go back and have build opportunities for greater employment, and go back to school and those pieces. So all of those things that we would expect to happen when you give individuals cash are proving that they happen, even when we're talking about poor Black mothers. And in a lot of times in this country, we do not paint with the best paintbrush. But the piece of our research that we are most excited about is really beginning to talk about how individuals are able to show up with joy, and how that is transforming their lives. And that's the long arc of the work. So, talking about the consumer sovereignty aspect of it and what people are able to buy and those things, that's cool. That's great. We care about those things. But I get really excited when I see moms whose entire personalities in some effects have transformed because the stress and the burden of constantly having to worry about what it is that they would do if they had a small emergency come up that they would not be able to address, to see that eliminated, to see how they're able to talk to their kids about the future and that they're actually dreaming about their future for the first time, not just dreaming about their kids' future. That's the part of the work that gets me really excited. And that's what I really think sustainability is about. I'm so excited that 10 years from now, there's going to be some kid somewhere giving their valedictorian speech, and they're going to talk about the year that their mom got $1,000 for a month. They're not going to know my name. They're not going to know the name of the organization. None of that matters. But they're going to talk about how that year changed their family's life. And that, to me, is what we're learning. And that is the power of cash. And that's what's so exciting about all the work that we're all seeding.
Yeah, that is so well put. And it what you both have shared really touches on what the research has showed us from the tax credits as well, which are of course nationwide and have been around for decades. And so there's this really robust body of research. And it gets to these 2 points that there's this immediate poverty alleviation, but it also has this long tail of impact for families, including things like, and if there's funders among us who are early childhood funders, we see, better outcome for kids in early childhood all the way through high school graduation and aspirations to go on to college. Stacia talked about this employment effect. We see the same thing with the tax credits, where in the 80s and 90s, where there was a big work effort research that showed that more than half of the increase of employment among single mothers was due strictly to the receipt of cash through the tax credits. And so we see that this building body of research which shows health impacts, early childhood impacts, economic stability impacts. It's not just about the now, but about what's going to come for the next generation, which I think is it's just so tremendously exciting. And with the recent passage of the American Rescue Plan Act and the expansion of the child tax credits, we're seeing some real-time data about what's happening right now. The Pulse survey, which is this weekly survey that is coming out that is helping us understand the conditions of families, has already started to show that payments received in July, there was a 25% decrease in families, low-income families with children reporting food insecurity. So right away, like not next year, not 10 years from now, but right now, we're starting to see some positive impacts for families. And as we think about our job in philanthropy to really focus in on how we do the most good for the most people, it's these set of policies which we can center on.
So, Amy, can I tell a quick story based on what you just said about what we're seeing immediately with the child tax credit? So the first check started in July, and immediately we started trying to gather data, qualitative data, specifically from our moms about what they were using the money for and how it was helping. And one of our moms told me, it was a sweet story that broke my heart, because I was like, it's the really simple things that we take for granted. As I asked her, what was she going to use her first check for? And she's like, well, I'm going to buy school supplies. And she was like, my kids are really excited because it's the first time that they'll be able to pick out their backpack themselves. Every year, their kid had gotten a backpack that had been donated by either Springboard or some other organization, and you just get whatever is given to you. She's like, my kid is really excited about being able to walk down the aisle and pick out their backpack. And it broke my heart, because I thought about that, and I'm like, you're right, because I have 2 kids and the school started, and not even my 3-year-old was excited about picking out his backpack. So it's the small things that so many of us take for granted that really have large impacts and really create memories for a lifetime.
And I'll just say, at least in Richmond, I mean, we won't have our findings until the end of our pilot, which is 24 months, that provides $500 a month for families that are working really hard, right? And they've hit the cliff effect, or the benefit cliff. And so they're still not making a living wage, and they're the head of household and they have children, but they're having their supports taken away from them. And so what really drove this approach was like, if we help people get over that cliff, how much more is going to be possible for them? What could they choose to dream about, to actually do that is their own, and that shows that people are more than capable of like directing their own life and doing well. And so, while we won't have that data until the end of next year, because the pilot started making disbursements at the end of 2020, what we did hear when recipients were enrolled were things like, wow, that dream that I had about starting my own business, that may actually be a reality. Or my dream to own my own home, maybe I can make that happen. Or, hey, if I don't use all of that money at the end of the month, how can I pay it forward and help someone who didn't get this opportunity? And so when you talked about just joy and the capacity to like dream, that really resonated, because we heard that from recipients early on. So another important point that you all brought up was policy. So, we're seeing how cash, you've already talked about how that can break down these very real barriers for families, right? But what does that mean on a large scale level? Like, how can cash payments be leveraged to really implement the kind of policy change that's needed to really systemically break down those barriers?
We are in a very unfriendly policy landscape around cash right now. And I think we've all spoken to this to some extent, but I mean, you can only go so far with cash when you have paternalistic policies in place that say you can only have $2,000 in your bank account and you can't have a car, right? Otherwise, you're going to lose your housing benefit. Otherwise, you're going to lose your food stamps. So what we have set up is a system to keep people in their place and in poverty. So while it is excellent that we have the expansion of the child tax credit and that we have all of these different pilots, over 100 across the country, we can only go so far until we change complementary policies, right? So that we lift asset limits, that we allow people to earn and accumulate wealth at the same time that they have housing security and food security. We often say in this space that cash is not a panacea. It is something that must operate alongside other safety net benefits. And we have the money to do so, right? It's like we all say, budgets are moral documents, right? And so when we make decisions to keep people locked in their place, right, that is a moral failing of this country and can absolutely be changed. And I think we're starting to see some of that with the child tax credit expansion. And also, for example, California appropriated $35 million in order to pilot guaranteed income statewide, which will likely also result in some changes in state policy there, such that families do not have those barriers where, you know, you're making too much money, therefore you're losing your household food security. So some good momentum, a lot of work to do.
Mm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We have, I feel like we've made some really important steps forward, but there's a lot of room for movement. I'll maybe just call forward, you know, if we think about our families in immigrant and migrant communities or in mixed status families, a lot of our policies are not helping them reach economic security. The expansion of the federal tax credits are phenomenal, but they are insufficient in terms of their treatment of immigrant families. Now, our states, California, others have expanded their state tax credits to include families who are have I-10 status, who are filing as immigrant workers, but we need to push that at the federal level, because if we think about economic security, there's for an individual, there's for my family unit, there's for my extended family and my community, and we have to have this kind of broader look at how we establish economic security, and including immigrant workers has to be just central to that agenda. And then maybe just to double down on Stacey's point about our systems. I often think about this in the context of, as families are receiving these monthly benefits, let's take the child tax credit as an example, they're telling us things like, you know, I'm going to be able to use this to offset my childcare expenses and this and that, but we need those public systems where very high quality childcare is available in every community. So that family can take those resources and buy as good a childcare as anyone can buy anywhere. Similarly, excellent healthcare, so that family can get as good as healthcare services as anywhere in the country. And so these policies have to work in tandem, or else we're not really fulfilling the promise of them.
So, oh, I'm sorry. Did you want, okay. So what is philanthropy's role in this moment? So there's a lot happening. How could philanthropy play a role? It sounds like there are different ways. And I'll stop there. I actually have another question about philanthropy, but let's start there. What is philanthropy's role in this moment?
Well, why don't I start? I mean, I think we have different moments. So let me focus on the moment that's tax credits moments, and then we can broaden the lens to additional moments. So I think philanthropy has an incredibly important role right now and in the months to come about making sure that every family who's eligible for the expansion of the federal tax credits can get them. So let me just double down on this. With the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act in March, it made much more robust and much more powerful the child tax credit. When we turn to tax time in 2022, the robustness of the earned income tax credit expansions also come into play. But we have to get families into the portals and getting those payments in order to receive them. And who's not getting them at the moment are the hardest to reach families. So philanthropy has been playing a role and has a big role to play this in the fall of 2021 on outreach, really supporting and expanding the capacity of existing community partners who are trusted messengers for those families to say, hey, you know what, you might be eligible for this. Come on in, we can get you signed up. In addition, and I think this connects some of the dots, is that there's an important body of work for philanthropy to do to continue to change the narrative on why we should be helping low-income families, working families access unrestricted cash. I feel like in this country, we've started to turn the curve on that with economic incentive payments, with the expansion of the tax credits, with the pilots, but there is so much more to do. And so collecting the stories and helping families tell their own stories, that's an important investment opportunity for philanthropy to build that narrative and make sure that we can continue to walk that path, and that, you know, that we don't backpedal in the next few months. And then I would say, looking down the line, there's really an important role for philanthropy to play to make sure that families who are receiving the tax credits and other cash payments are not getting them in kind of predatory settings. What we know too often in low-income communities is when the cash arrives, the predatory lenders and the predatory practitioners follow on behind. So making sure that families are accessing the tax credits in non-predatory settings, are able to get their taxes done in free, high-quality, non-predatory settings is a coupling policy that philanthropy has supported over the years and needs to have their eye on as we turn towards 2022.
So I'll go next, I guess. I'm going to answer this from the perspective of really how we saw what happened in Jackson and what happened in Stockton grow into this movement, and where does philanthropy fit in moving that forward, right? So in both locations, we centered not only on some really strong empiricism, some really strong quantitative data, but we also focused on narrative change and storytelling, as Amy pointed out, understanding that the way that we create policy is through both of those things, knowing that, our policy wonks and our legislators will to some extent be moved by data, but the public has to come along with us, right? And that is done through really strong storytelling, documentaries, websites, long form news features. Don't go do this by yourself. By the way, there's a whole crew of us, right, that are thinking about how do we move this policy sentiment toward cash. And so, while the disbursements in many cases, the disbursements of cash, are being funded now through state dollars, the work around research and narrative change and storytelling, the feds are not paying us for that. So philanthropy really has a space there to support the research and the narrative change through whatever sort of media and mechanisms that you fancy.
No, definitely ditto to all that. And also, the state is not paying some of us, y'all. I'm in Mississippi, so the state is not paying me for my cash disbursements. So I still need philanthropy to liberate some capital this way so we can continue to work. And so I think there's a role for philanthropy to come in a lot of different ways, every way that Amy and Stacia said. And I definitely want to dig into the narrative piece, because that's been such a big part of our work over the last few years. And it's definitely a part of our work going forward. One of my good friends, Ann Price, always says that policy moves at the speed of narrative. And we understand, for those individuals who are our policymakers, the disconnect between what is happening in the streets and what they believe is actually happening is more than a mile wide. This past year has showed me that like none other. So really making sure that we are informing and educating policymakers on the lived experiences and realities of individuals is pertinent as we move forward. Because for all of us, I think the bigger goal is for federal legislation that results in a long-term guaranteed income or a long-term child tax credit expansion. I don't think any of us is doing this work just thinking that it will be an offshoot and that in 3 years or 5 years or whatever the magic number is, all of our work will have been for naught. And so there's a role for philanthropy in that. And I also think there's a role for philanthropy to help as it relates to the plethora of resources that are available. I think sometimes those of us who are working in the field, specifically community-based organizations, feed into the scarcity mindset that, okay, if that organization is doing something, well, then there's no resources for me to do that same thing. And it pits us into this competition with each other. And that's problematic. And, as Stacia said, when we started this work, it was us two. Now there are so many individuals. And so I'm often asked how I feel about that. I feel great about that. I feel like it is a pond and all of us are throwing our pebbles into the pond and having this massive ripple effect, which is going to disrupt the tide much more quicker than Seed and Magnolia Mothers Trust could do it alone. But I need philanthropy to have that mindset as well and help individuals understand that, there are billions of dollars out here. Individuals can pay to go to the outer sky. They didn't even make it to the moon. They went to the outer sky. So individuals can pay to go to the outer sky. So there are billions of dollars in resources out here. And so we don't have to work against each other. We really can work in collaboration and have open flows of communication and channels of transparency and collaboration, because our work may look different in how we go about actualizing it, but at the end of the day, it's the same North Star.
I'm so glad you said that, which kind of segues into my next question of why is the practice of cash payments important for philanthropy? And from my perspective, seeing the impact that we see in a very real way on what families tell us, but then also in a larger way on what the data tells us, it is no longer enough to not consider if cash payments should be part of a program, right? So, a lot of my work has been focused on workforce development. And we know that a lot of the reasons why folks don't complete, short-term credentialing programs could be because of issues like not being able to pay for childcare, not being able to afford to repair a car that broke down, or to afford another mode of transportation. And so knowing how impactful cash has been, we have to start incorporating that into programs. And so when we receive proposals from organizations that are asking us to provide them additional dollars for wraparound supports, that's important now. We have all the information we need to say, yes, that is an important component of that program. And now we also have, thanks to you all, the information to say, philanthropy can also play a larger role in this movement beyond just those programs, which are so important. But what does that actually mean for how we get some policy change so that this whole system works better for families? So that was my perspective on the question of why the cash payments are an important practice for philanthropy. But I did want to give you all a chance to add anything if you would like to.
I mean, to me, so much. I'm a trained social worker. I worked in homelessness and domestic violence for a number of years. And so many of the things that we put money at federally or through grant dollars, it's just treating the symptoms of poverty, right? So if we look at domestic violence, if we look at homelessness, substance abuse, mental health crises, right? So these are issues that stem from poverty. So as philanthropists, you can just treat the disease. You can just treat poverty alongside, of course, those symptoms as well. But I think if we want to get the best bang for your buck, right? Let's treat poverty. Let's just get to the root of it, and let's trust people to make their own decisions. Because what we have seen, not only in this country but also internationally, that cash is an effective solution. You can trust people just like you trust your neighbor, right? To make great decisions about what to do with their money.
No, definitely. I think it's the trust piece that Stacia just mentioned. And I think if we're being honest, we just really have to name a thing, that in this country, we inherently, for the most part, don't trust poor people. We associate poverty with moralism. We believe individuals are poor because they choose to be poor. And we do not challenge the systems that exist that allow poverty to exist. And poverty exists as a system. And it is something that we have created. It is something that we can implement other strategies and solutions for it no longer to exist. But that is we have to be willing to do that. And as a country, we haven't been willing to do that. We haven't been willing to divorce ourselves from the ideas that we have been complacent in how we go about letting our neighbors be treated and how we go about letting our neighbors live. And that is something that we all will have to reckon with. But as it relates to philanthropy, you now have the information necessary to recognize that there is a different way to do this, and there is a different way to support your missions and support the individuals and organizations that you care about. So I think the challenge is whether or not you will take that information and choose to be bold and imaginative and lean into radical imagination, or if we'll continue to do the status quo. The status quo has enough friends. You don't have to be its friend.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just to tie some of these pieces back together, it is the role, one important job for philanthropy here is to fund this work, to test this, to push the boundaries so that public policy can change. There's only so many dollars in philanthropy. We are not going to be able to solve poverty in the US as individual philanthropic actors, but joining together, supporting these kinds of pilots and projects, efforts, policy innovations in the states, and getting the policy change at a national level, then we will have really used our leverage to make big time change.
And going back to something important that you mentioned when you said trust, right? I do want to bring this back to people. because the reality is a lot of times in philanthropy, we're all focused on our different focus areas, right? We have different issues that we address, whether that's education, healthcare, it could be a number of those things. But the reality is when you're talking about people, their lives are not split into these artificial boundaries. And so this gives you a way not just to look at the whole person, right? But also a way to collaborate with peers and kind of make bundle resources and have greater impact in a way that's kind of beyond the silo that we typically operate in. And so if we start thinking about people and centering them and thinking about trust and how we can trust them to do the best things for themselves, then I think that sort of changes the whole way that we approach the work that we do. So I did want to ask because, based on what we've discussed today, I wouldn't be surprised if we have some folks who are newly interested in thinking about, well, how do I apply this to my work, right? And so one thing I did want to ask you all as experts in this space is first, what are some special design considerations, right? So you all have talked about a few things that I think are really important to point out that, hey, if you're interested in thinking about starting a guaranteed income program or thinking about helping families access tax credits, what are important things to keep in mind as you start that work?
I'll go first as it relates to guaranteed income, and it's real simple. You don't do anything without the people. If you are about to design a guaranteed income project, it would behoove you to connect with the population that it is that you are serving to make sure that what it is that you are proposing actually aligns to what their needs are. Everything about the Magnolia Mothers Trust, everything about SEED came directly from the community. Let's be very clear. I was not sitting around in 2017 trying to figure out how I could create more stress in my life. I got two kids. I don't need any more stress. So I was not sitting around trying to figure out how could I go about giving people money. It came from the people that they needed money, and I had to figure out how to address that. So if you are thinking about doing a cash disbursement project, connect with the population, develop a task force, check what your assumptions are, and truly lean into making sure that what it is that you're proposing is something that will benefit your population.
I absolutely agree from the research side as well. We don't do any research on communities. We do research with participants and communities. And so it's not the sort of situation where, you want to extract data or you want to parade one of your recipients around to the media, right? So all of these things are done in community and with the advice of community. And that includes even kind of thinking about the idea of starting a pilot. There's an incredible group called the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice that really leads in this space and provides technical assistance as well as advice to philanthropists, advice around research. And I think we're all connected in there. So that's a great place to start.
I would say, from a tax credit perspective, all of this is actually all still true there, because from the tax credits work that is the most powerful, the most long lasting, begins with a conversation in community about how can we craft this in a way that gets us to our community goals. Those set of policies which are created under the dome in state capitals or in the nation's capital are weak because they don't have the community legs that are supporting them and to stand on. And so I think everything that has been said is also true of tax credits policy. In the most recent moment, the moment that we have in front of us around outreach, similarly, this is about people in community talking to each other about the value of these tax credits. It's not the big flashy ad campaign, although I'm sure that's great and helpful too, but it is about person-to-person contact. It is building that trust. It is weaving that fabric of community and saying, this is a thing we can do together.
Well, it is time for us to start wrapping up. And so before we do, are there any sort of parting words of wisdom that you like to leave our audience members with?
Maybe I'll begin, and I would just encourage our colleagues in philanthropy to do something. Don't be afraid. There are places to begin that build on your current portfolio, whether that's health or education or early childhood, where you can take pieces of what have been identified today and say, oh, we could do that. We have a grantee who's kind of like that we could add capacity to. So it is a not start from scratch moment for you, which no one can manage at this particular time. It is looking to where you have strength and can you add these set of opportunities to build on that strength.
I think I would add just to be brave and innovative. I think all of us that you've met here today really put our careers on the line and put our reputations on the line a couple of years ago when we started this work. So, we've softened the ground for you to do this alongside us. But be brave and innovative. Think about what you're funding. Think about, is that actually bringing gender and race and economic justice to the communities that you care about? And where might cash fit into that space?
Stacia said all the things I was going to say, so I'll just say, tap into radical imagination.
And I'll just add to that, I've heard so many times in our field, people say, we've been doing this for so long and so many resources have been sent out. Why haven't things changed? I want to say I agree. Try something different. I mean, we have so much evidence that suggests that this practice can be transformational. So yes, be brave, be bold, try something different, and make sure that whatever you're trying, yes, is informed by the folks who know what they need the most. So trust. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for your time today, both our speakers and our audience. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.